The Scent of Lies and the Fire After. Part 1. The Smoke Before the Flame. The key turned in the lock the way it always did, with that slight catch, that half-second resistance before the tumblers gave way. Andreana Marino had always meant to get it fixed. She hadn't. Story of her life lately, she thought, letting small problems linger until they became something she'd stopped noticing altogether. She shifted the grocery bags in her arms and pushed the door open with her hip. The house smelled wrong. She stood in the foyer and let that land, not immediately trusting the instinct. Wrong was such a useless word. It wasn't bad exactly. It was something more specific than that. Something floral and foreign. Something that her brain tried to dismiss before her gut finished cataloging it. Peony. Not rose. Not lavender. Peony, that rich, slightly heavy bloom that cost too much and lasted too little. Andreana didn't own a single peony-scented thing in this house. But she knew who did. She stood very still in her foyer for a long moment. The groceries were heavy. She'd bought salmon because DEON had said he was craving it. She'd gone to the Good Market, the one on Henderson that charged $3 more per pound but sold wild-caught because she loved him. Because she was that kind of woman, the kind who noticed what a person craved and went out of her way for it on a Thursday afternoon. She set the bags down. Later, she would not be able to explain why she didn't call out his name the way she normally would. Hey, babe, I'm back. Some part of her, the animal, honest part, already knew. It was already writing the ending while her conscious mind was still on the first page, still arguing that the scent was a candle, was a new lotion, was nothing. Was coincidence. She walked up the stairs. She had bought this house. That was the thing she would come back to again and again in the weeks that followed, the fact that kept surfacing like something heavy that refused to sink. She had bought it. Her down payment, her credit, her name on the deed alone because DEON had said he was between solid ground financially and she'd said that's fine, we're partners, paper doesn't matter. She had climbed every single one of these stairs, in paint-stained clothes, arguing cheerfully with contractors, imagining what these rooms could become. She was remembering the shade of cream she'd chosen for the bedroom walls when she opened the door. The light was afternoon gold, slanting through curtains she'd picked out at a market in Savannah on a weekend trip she and LENA had taken 2 years ago. She remembered that trip with sudden, surgical clarity, the laughter, the wine, LENA saying, "Dree, you're going to make this place a home. I swear to God you've got the most beautiful eye." As she stood in the doorway and looked at DEON Lux and LENA Berkshire in the bed she slept in every night. For a moment nobody moved. The tableau had an almost cinematic quality, the way shock sometimes aestheticizes itself to protect the mind. DEON on his back, LENA half-draped across his chest, her dark hair, that beautiful hair Andreana had spent an hour helping her deep condition just last weekend, in this house, in this bathroom, fanned across the pillow. LENA's eyes opened first. They found Andreana's and they went wide, and Andreana watched the sequence of emotions cross her best friend's face like weather moving fast across an open field. Shock, then guilt, and this was the thing she would never fully forgive. A flash of something almost like relief. As though the secret had become too heavy, and the exposure, even this catastrophic one, was a kind of putting it down. Dree. DEON sat up. He said her name the way a man says the name of something he's broken. Andreana Marino stood in the doorway of her bedroom for a breath longer. She felt very far away from herself and also very precisely, terribly present. The cream walls. The Savannah curtains. The salmon downstairs going warm. How long, she said. Her voice came out calm. It came out so calm that all three of them seemed startled by it. DEON opened his mouth. Don't, she said softly. Don't figure out what to say. I want the number. How long? The silence was its own answer. Long, it said. Long enough that you should have known. Long enough that some part of you did. Part 2. Every sign she chose not to read. 18 months earlier. The perfume first. She should start there, because that was the first real crack, the first place where the foundation showed its fault line. It was a Tuesday in September, 14 months before the day of the groceries and the open door. Andreana had come home early from her firm, a client meeting had cancelled, and DEON hadn't been expecting her. He was in the bathroom when she arrived, in the shower, and she'd gone to his jacket to take his dry cleaning to the closet where they kept the pile for the weekend run. She'd pressed her face into the collar automatically. She did that sometimes. Smelled his clothes. It was an intimacy so small she'd never spoken it aloud, just something her body did because it loved his scent, cedar and something clean, something essentially him. What she got instead stopped her hand mid-motion. Peony. She held the jacket and stood there. A client, she thought. Someone who got close in a crowded elevator. A coworker with too much on. She ran through the list with the industriousness of a woman who was not ready to reach the end of it. You're home early, DEON said from the bathroom doorway, a towel around his waist. He looked good. He always looked good, and she had always allowed that to do some of the emotional labor that clear eyes should have done. Meeting fell through. She smiled. She hung up the jacket. How was your day? Long, he said. Boring. You know. She nodded. She didn't ask about the perfume. Why don't you ask about the perfume? She would demand of herself, later, in the private courtroom she held in her own chest at 2 a.m. Because I loved him, she would answer. Because love is sometimes just a very sophisticated form of not wanting to know. Then there was the dinner party at Marcus and Jade's, a Friday in November of that same year. Lena had come with Dante, big, steady Dante Berkshire, who wore his quiet the way some men wore authority, naturally, without effort, like a second skin. ANDREANA had always liked Dante in the peripheral way you like a friend's partner, aware of his goodness, glad he existed, not particularly interested in looking directly at him. At some point during the evening she'd gone to the kitchen for more wine and found him there alone, leaning against the counter, looking out the dark window at the garden with the expression of a man listening to something nobody else could hear. Hiding, she'd asked. He'd looked at her and smiled. It was a slow smile, unhurried, the kind that came from somewhere real. Recharging, he said. There's a difference. What's the difference? Hiding is about something outside. Recharging is about something inside. He tilted his head slightly. You hiding or recharging? She'd laughed, genuinely laughed, surprised by it. I'm not sure I've ever made that distinction before. That's interesting, he said. He said it like he meant it, like he filed it away. Not to use against her, just to know. She'd felt something then, small and inconvenient, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Cabernet she was pouring. She'd attributed it to the wine anyway and gone back to the party. Later that night, across the living room, she'd caught DEON watching Lena laugh at someone's joke. Just watching. With an expression so unguarded she'd almost not recognized him in it. Hunger. Tenderness. Something she hadn't seen on his face in a while, directed at her. She'd looked away. He's just being friendly, she'd thought. He likes Lena, everyone likes Lena. She'd picked up her glass and talked to Marcus about something she couldn't now remember, and she'd been very careful, for the rest of the night, not to look at DEON watching Lena. The text notification had been the next thing. This was winter, February, she remembered, because the heat in her car had been acting up and she'd been cold all day. She and DEON were sitting on the couch watching something they'd half chosen and half abandoned, both on their phones, that modern intimacy of parallel distraction. His phone buzzed, and he tilted it away from her before he read it, and then he typed a reply and set the phone face down. The motion was so practiced it almost wasn't noticeable. Almost. Who's that? She asked, keeping her eyes on the television. Marcus, he said. About the game Sunday. She nodded. Later, in the bathroom, she looked at her own face in the mirror and thought, you're doing it again. You're letting something go by. But what did she have really? A tilted phone. A face-down screen. The smallest, most deniable of gestures. She could raise it and be wrong, be the woman who didn't trust her man over nothing, be insecure, be difficult, or she could let it go and be at peace. She chose peace. Chosen peace is a slow-burning kind of self-betrayal. Then Lena's marriage started fracturing. It had happened the way these things apparently happen, gradually and then catastrophically, like a windshield crack that travels slowly across the glass for months before the whole thing spiderwebs in an instant. Dante had become distant, Lena said. Dante had become cold. Dante had accused her of things she wouldn't name clearly, and when ANDREANA had pressed, gently, carefully, Lena had looked at her hands and said, he thinks I'm not being honest with him. Are you? ANDREANA had asked. And Lena had looked up at her with those wide amber eyes and said, he's not being fair to me, Dre. That's all I know. She hadn't pressed further. You don't press your best friend when she's hurting. That's the rule. When Dante threw Lena out, or Lena left, depending on who was telling it, and the versions differed in ways that should have told her something, it was ANDREANA who said immediately, without discussion, you'll come here. You'll stay with us. She'd told DEON that night, expecting, she realized now, hoping for some resistance, some mild friction, something. A man who was purely innocent would simply say, of course, poor Lena, bring her over. DEON had said, yeah, of course. She should come. He'd said it too easily. She told herself that easiness was generosity. Part 3. The space between two truths. Lena had been staying with them for 3 weeks when the second peony moment happened. This time it was on the bathroom shelf, a small bottle, Lena's, because Lena lived here now and had spread her things through the space with the comfortable casualness of someone long at home. Which she was. Which she had always been in this house. And in other things, apparently. ANDREANA had picked up the bottle. Read the label. Maison Margiela. Replica. Flower Market. She'd set it back down. She'd stood in the bathroom for a full minute. Then she'd gone downstairs and made coffee and not thought about it. She had not thought about it with such ferocity and intention that it exhausted her. She'd sat at her kitchen table and made herself think about work, about the Henderson account, about whether they needed more olive oil, about anything at all that was not the small glass bottle and the collar of a jacket from 14 months ago. She'd thought about Dante Berkshire instead. Strange mental anchor, strange place for her mind to land, but it landed on the memory of him in Marcus's kitchen, backlit by the dark window, talking about the difference between hiding and recharging. You hiding or recharging? She was neither, she thought. She was sitting very still in the middle of something and calling it nothing, and she didn't have a word for that. She'd run into Dante 3 weeks later, by accident. He'd been at the Framers on Clement Street. She'd seen him through the window first, his broad back, the particular way he stood, unhurried and solid, and she'd gone in on instinct before she'd thought about whether that was wise. ANDREANA. Dante. Hi. She'd felt inexplicably nervous, which was ridiculous. What are you framing? He held up a photograph. It was a picture of a coastline, shot at the blue hour, that specific threshold between sunset and dark when the world looks like it's deciding something. It's beautiful, she said. Found it in a box. Forgot I had it. He looked at it for a moment longer, then at her. How is she? The question was quiet. No venom, no accusation. Just the flat, real weight of a man asking about someone he'd loved. She's okay, Andreana said carefully. She's managing. He nodded. His jaw tightened fractionally and then released. You're good to her, he said. You've always been good to her. Something in his tone made the words land strangely, as though they were also about something else. She's my best friend, Andreana said. Was some new, cold voice in her said. She ignored it. They stood in the framer's shop and talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential, the neighborhood, a restaurant that had closed, a book they'd both read without knowing it. She was aware the whole time of a very specific sensation, the feeling of being genuinely seen. He listened the way he always had, completely, as though what she was saying mattered to the exact degree she felt it mattered. When she left, she walked to her car and sat in it for a moment. Her heart was doing something embarrassing. Proximity, she told herself firmly. He's hurting, I'm stressed, we're both in strange orbits. Proximity does things to people. It's science, not meaning. She drove home. Lena was on the couch. DEON came in from the kitchen to kiss her cheek, and she noticed he held Lena's gaze a beat too long when he sat back down, and she opened her laptop and reviewed the Henderson account and thought about absolutely nothing. Part 4. The day the house burned down. The groceries. The salmon. The door that always caught before it gave. Standing now in the doorway of her bedroom, the room with the cream walls and the Savannah curtains, Andreana Marino felt the past 18 months organize themselves behind her eyes with the cruel efficiency of understanding arriving too late. The jacket. The tilted phone. Lena's careful non-answers. The way DEON had said yeah, of course, she should come without a single beat of hesitation. The peony on the bathroom shelf, and the peony on his collar, and the way those two things had always had a straight line between them that she had simply refused to draw. 3. DEON was sitting up now, sheet pulled, the caught expression of a man who had rehearsed 100 versions of the scene and found that none of them fit the actual woman standing in the door. Let me explain. Dante knew, she said. It wasn't a question. The silence confirmed it. She looked at Lena. Lena, who had been her friend for 11 years. Who had been the maid of honor at the wedding Andreana had always assumed was coming. Who had held her hand through her father's illness and talked her off ledges and known every one of her soft places. Lena looked back at her with tears running silently and still said nothing. How long has Dante known? Andreana said. 3. How long? About 8 months, Lena whispered. 8 months. He had been carrying this for 8 months. He had known, and he had not called her, and he had not exposed it, and he had, she understood now with a lurch, protected her in the only way available to him, by trying to end his own marriage rather than be the one to bring Andreana's world down. She picked up the groceries from the foyer. She didn't know she was going to do it until she was doing it, walking back down the stairs, collecting the bags from where she'd set them, walking out the front door. She sat in her car in the driveway, and she was not crying, not yet, that would come later in waves that surprised her with their physical force. Right now she was just very, very still. She picked up her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. Andreana. Dante Berkshire's voice came through the line low, steady. That voice that she associated now with kitchens at parties and blue-hour coastlines and the difference between hiding and recharging. You knew, she said. A long pause. A breath. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because, he said quietly, I watched you love him. And I didn't think it was mine to take that apart. I thought, he stopped. Started again. I thought if I was wrong I'd have destroyed something that mattered. And if I was right, I'd still have destroyed something that mattered. So I handled my own side of it. She sat with that. That's either the most selfless thing anyone's ever done for me, she said, or the worst decision. Maybe both, he said. There was a ghost of something in his voice, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. Are you okay? No. Where are you? My driveway. Do you want to not be there? She looked at the house. Her house. Her down payment and her contractors and her cream walls and her ruined bed. Yes, she said. I very much want to not be here. Part 5. Learning to stand on ground that holds. He met her at the small Italian place on Varela that neither of them had planned, that she'd driven to simply because her hands needed somewhere to point the car. He was already outside when she pulled up, hands in his coat pockets, and she had the sudden, irrational awareness of how much space he occupied, not physically, though he was a large man, but presently. The way some people simply take up their portion of the world without apology and without excess. They sat across from each other in a corner booth and ordered wine they barely drank and food they ate slowly, and she talked. She talked more than she had talked to any human being in a long time, not because he pushed her but because he made it safe, the way certain rooms make you breathe deeper simply by virtue of their proportions. She told him about the jacket, the perfume, the tilted phone, the months of small, muted wrongness she had insisted on calling nothing. He listened with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on her face, and when she finished he said, You're not stupid, Andreana. You're someone who loves someone. Those two things can look the same from the inside and they're completely different things. Something cracked in her chest. Just a little. Just enough. How did you get through it? She asked. Knowing. Carrying it. He looked at his wine. Not well, he said. I got through it the way you get through anything you can't fix. One day, then another. And I held on to, he stopped. His thumb traced the rim of his glass. I held on to the parts of my life that still made sense to me. Like what? He looked up at her. The booth was quiet. The restaurant hummed around them. And ANDREANA became aware, in a way that embarrassed and confused her, of an extraordinary amount of heat. Not metaphorical heat, not abstract warmth, but a physical sensation, as though the air between them had thickened, had become something with weight and temperature. She picked up her wine glass. I should let you get home, she said. I have nowhere to be, he said simply. Neither do I, she thought. Her house was not her home right now. Her house was a place where something had ended. They stayed another hour. She slept in a hotel that first night. She lay in the hotel bed in the dark and did not cry immediately. She stared at the ceiling and processed, methodically, the inventory of her losses. DEON. 5 years. The future she'd arranged around him like furniture around a focal point. LENA. 11 years. The texture of a friendship so old she'd stopped examining it, the way you stop examining the walls of a room you live in. The house, not lost, hers entirely and legally, but emptied of the meaning she'd put in it. Then she thought about Dante Berkshire in the corner booth, looking up at her when she asked what he'd held on to, and the way the air had felt. Stop, she told herself. You are a woman in a hotel bed who found out her boyfriend and her best friend have been lying to her for the better part of 2 years. You're not, you are absolutely not doing whatever this is. Proximity, she reminded herself. Mutual catastrophe. Shared wound. It's the most natural thing in the world to feel close to someone who's been through the same wreck. It doesn't mean anything. She said it with conviction. She didn't entirely believe it. Part 6. Fire in the architecture. The second time she saw him was 3 days later, which felt like both too soon and the exact right amount of time. He texted, I have your salmon. Apparently you left it in the Italian place's takeout bag by mistake. The owner called me because my name was on the reservation. She'd stared at the text for a full minute. Then, that cannot possibly be true. It is not true, he replied. But I'm making salmon anyway and I have enough for 2. If you're not busy. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed and read it twice, and felt her entire face do something involuntary. She went. His apartment was in the Whitmore building on Selden, older, well-kept, with the particular quiet of a place where someone lived simply and intentionally. He buzzed her up and opened the door in a gray t-shirt, and she registered, in the way you register things you're trying not to register, that he was extraordinary looking. She had always known this the way you know the height of a ceiling as fact, not feeling. Now standing in his doorway with her heart in some new configuration, she noticed it differently. Come in, he said. The apartment smelled like garlic and lemon and something herbal. Something real. She stepped inside and the warmth of it, the cooking smell, the low lamp light, the whole inhabitable humanness of the space, did something to the knot she'd been carrying in her sternum for 4 days. You didn't have to do this, she said. No, he agreed, turning back to the stove. She sat at the kitchen island and watched him cook. There was something unconsciously graceful about it, the economy of his movements, the way he knew where everything was, the quiet confidence of a person alone in a space they'd made theirs. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Did you ever, she looked at her hands, when you were with LENA, did you ever suspect there was someone else before you knew for certain? He was quiet for a moment. I knew something was wrong, he said finally. I knew the texture of things had changed. The way you know weather is coming before the sky changes. He turned to look at her. But I didn't want to push it because I wasn't sure if the problem was her or if the problem was me. Whether I was too far inside myself and she was just responding to that. Were you? Some, he admitted. We'd both gotten lost. Just in opposite directions. He turned back to the stove. The hardest part is accepting that a relationship can fail for multiple reasons simultaneously. That her doing something terrible doesn't erase the parts where I failed. Both things exist. ANDREANA looked at him. You're very honest about yourself, she said. I've had time to think, he said. She became aware again of the heat. That specific, inconvenient, unignorable warmth. She was close to the stove, which explained nothing because the heat wasn't coming from the stove. It was coming from the 17 inches of kitchen island between her arm and his. She shifted back on her stool. He placed a plate in front of her. Thank you, she said. For this. For the other night too. You didn't have to. You needed somewhere to land, he said simply. He sat across the island from her with his own plate. Somebody once told me there's a difference between hiding and recharging. She looked up. Something in her expression made him smile. That slow, real smile, and she looked down at her plate with the desperate focus of a woman who needed to eat salmon and think about absolutely nothing. Weeks passed. Not smoothly. In fragments, fits and starts, the way healing always moves, the 3 steps forward and the sudden, unexpected 2 steps back when a song or a smell or a particular angle of light brings the loss back up, fresh as new. She handled the house practically. Had the locks changed? DEON collected his things with Marcus as an intermediary, which was a small mercy she hadn't asked for but accepted. LENA tried to call 4 times. She didn't answer. She wasn't ready for that conversation and suspected she might never be ready for it in the way Lena wanted, looking for absolution, looking for the friendship to absorb the damage and restructure around it. Some things don't restructure. Some things just end, and you carry the missing weight of them like a phantom limb. She went back to the house and opened the windows and cleaned it room by room with the systematic, almost meditative thoroughness of someone reclaiming territory. She changed the bedroom curtains. Not because she hated the Savannah ones, she still thought they were beautiful. But she needed the room to be new. She needed to stop seeing the afternoon gold light falling across a scene she could not unremember. Dante helped her hang the new ones. He'd come to help her move some furniture, which had been the stated purpose, and they'd gotten sidetracked. She wasn't sure how, into the curtain project, and then somehow into an argument about whether the left side was hanging 2 inches lower than the right. Which it was, and which he denied with an equanimity that made her laugh so suddenly and completely she had to put her hand on the windowsill. It's crooked, Dante. It's got character. It's crooked. You're very precise. I'm an architect, of course I'm precise. And the world thanks you for it, he said gravely. He reached up and adjusted the rod. His arm came close to her head and she went very still, and for a moment the laughter faded and something else took its place, the silence, the closeness, the smell of him, clean and warm and cedar. He lowered his arm. He didn't step back immediately. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The moment lasted exactly as long as they could both justify it before one of them moved. She stepped back first. Better, she said, looking at the curtain. Much, he said. He was looking at her. She walked to the other side of the room and picked up a paint swatch she didn't need to examine. Her heart was doing the thing again. The inconvenient, traitorous, embarrassing thing. Proximity, she thought. But she thought it quieter now. With less conviction. The word was wearing thin from overuse. The gallery opening, 6 weeks after the beginning. Marcus and Jade's friend had a show, photographs, large format, landscapes mostly, and the whole group had been invited. ANDREANA went because she was rebuilding the ordinary scaffolding of her life, and ordinary things like gallery openings were part of that scaffolding. Dante was there because Marcus had invited him independently, which meant neither of them had engineered it, which ANDREANA told herself mattered. She saw him across the gallery before he saw her. He was in a dark jacket, a glass of white wine in his hand, looking at a photograph of fog on a mountain road, looking at it the way he looked at things, with that full attention that made inanimate objects seem honored by the notice. She watched him for a moment longer than was casual. He turned and found her eyes with an ease that suggested he'd known she was there. He crossed the room. They stood side by side in front of the fog photograph and talked quietly about it, and then about the one beside it, a coastline at blue hour not unlike the one he'd been framing on Clement Street. Their shoulders were perhaps 2 inches apart. The room was warm with bodies and low lighting, and she was hyper-aware of every fractional shift in the distance between them. This one, she said, pointing to a photograph of an open field, golden hour, a line of trees at the distant edge. This one gets me. Why? She looked at it. Because it looks like something's about to happen, she said. The light's that particular quality where everything's about to change. Like the world's holding its breath. He looked at the photograph. Then at her. Yeah, he said quietly. I see that. The gallery hummed. Someone laughed loudly across the room. ANDREANA felt his hand at the small of her back, barely there, the lightest navigation, steering her slightly to the left as someone moved past them. His hand stayed a half-second longer than navigation required. Her entire spine knew it. He removed his hand. Said nothing. She said nothing. They stayed at the gallery another hour and they talked to Marcus and Jade and other people, and she was aware the entire time of where he was in the room with the passive, constant, helpless accuracy of a compass finding north. In the parking lot, walking to their respective cars, he said, ANDREANA. She turned. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something held, something not quite contained, something that lived in the fraction of control before it gives. Nothing, he said. Get home safe. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and her heart at a full sprint. This is not what I think it is, she told herself. He is my friend's husband. My ex's, no, my ex-boyfriend was with my best friend who is now his ex-wife. The geometry of this is catastrophic. The geometry of this disqualifies us from whatever this is, from anything, because we are both people who just had our lives turned inside out by the people we trusted, and we are clearly, obviously, textbook obviously, just. She pulled into her driveway. She sat in the car for a while. Proximity, she tried. The word dissolved. Part 7. When the kindling ignites. The rainstorm that decided everything was not, on its face, dramatic. It was the kind of April storm that builds gradually, the sky going green-gray at the edges first, the wind picking up in that particular warning way, and she'd been on the back porch when it came. Having walked around to check the garden, she was slowly teaching herself to tend, and had been looking at the first small green things coming up through the soil when the rain came down like a wall. She made it back to the house door before it truly opened. She was still wet. Her hair, loose today, was darkened and dropping water, and she stood in her kitchen doorway laughing slightly at herself, at the sudden wild extravagance of the rain, at the fact that she'd been standing there watching crocuses and hadn't noticed the sky. Her phone buzzed. Power's out on Selden. Landlord says the whole block. I'm working off a laptop battery that has approximately 40 minutes left in it. This is a catastrophe. She was smiling before she'd finished reading it. Come here, she typed. I have power and food and I'm making soup. She stood in the kitchen and made soup, the real kind, not from a can, her grandmother's recipe that required patience and some ceremony, and she did not examine the particular quality of the anticipation she felt. She focused on the onions and the stock and the way the rain made the windows opaque and the house feel sealed from the world. He arrived with his hair wet and a bottle of red wine under his arm, and she opened the door, and they looked at each other, and the air immediately did the thing, the warmth, the density, the thing that no longer surprised her but hadn't gotten easier to be inside of. Thank you, he said. He stepped past her, and she caught his scent, rain-damp wool and cedar, and gripped the door handle. They ate at the kitchen table with the storm outside and the lamp on and the wine open, and they really talked, the kind of conversation that makes 2 hours feel like 20 minutes and leaves you slightly breathless, like you've been somewhere altitude is different. He told her about growing up in Savannah, which stopped her, Savannah, where she'd bought curtains with LENA, everything is Savannah, and about the architecture firm he'd left to start his own practice and the specific terror and freedom of that. She told him about her father, who had died believing she'd get married before 40 and had made her promise with such earnestness in the last month of his life that she'd said yes and had been privately grieving the version of herself that would have kept it. Do you still want that? Dante asked. Marriage. Family. She looked at her wine glass. I want it the way I want it to be real, she said. Not the way I was arranging it to seem real. DEON and I, she paused. I think I was in love with the idea of where we were going. The house, the trajectory. I loved him, but I think I had also I'd built a life-shaped structure and put him in it and called it love. Dante looked at her steadily. What does real look like then? For you. The question was serious. He was always serious about questions like this. Not heavy, just real, willing to actually receive the answer rather than simply asking to seem interested. Like I'm picked, she said. Specifically. Not as the woman who fits the shape someone needed. But like someone looked at me and decided. She felt exposed saying it. That probably sounds. No, he said. It doesn't. The lamp flickered once as thunder rolled close. She looked up. He was looking at her. In the low light with the storm outside and the soup and the wine and the 18 months of gravity between them, she saw it. She stopped pretending she didn't see it. Dante, she said. A warning. Or a beginning. She wasn't sure. I know, he said. This is. I know. We can't just. I know, he said again. But he said it differently this time, softer, an acknowledgement rather than an agreement. His hand, which had been resting near hers on the table, moved slightly. An inch. Just one. She looked at his hand near hers on the table. She looked at him. The lamp held steady. She turned her hand over. He placed his over it. They sat with that for a long time, with the rain coming down outside and neither of them saying anything, because some things don't need language, have never needed language, are in fact diminished by it. It was later, the wine half gone, the storm easing to a steady pour, the kitchen warm, when she said, I've been calling it proximity. He looked at her. What? Every time I felt, she made a slight gesture between them. I told myself it was proximity. That we were both in the same wound, and it made us feel close in a way that wasn't, that was artificial. He was quiet for a moment. When did you start feeling it? She thought about Marcus's kitchen. The dark window and the garden beyond. The difference between hiding and recharging. Marcus's dinner party, she said. 14 months ago. Something moved across his face. He looked at the table. Yeah, he said quietly. Me too. The kitchen held that. So it wasn't just proximity, she said. No, he said. Proximity doesn't create things. He looked for it. It lets things that were already there know they're allowed. She felt everything she called proximity, and timing, and mutual catastrophe, and convenience, and weakness, and terrible ideas. She felt all of those names fall away, one by one. Like scaffolding coming down from something that had been built solid enough to stand alone. She stood up. She picked up her wine glass, and she walked around the table to where he was sitting, and she stood in front of him, and he looked up at her, and she looked down at him, and there was one last moment of recognition, of both of them seeing the full weight and history and choice of this clearly, choosing it with open eyes, and then she set down the wine glass and his hands came to her waist, and the flame that had been banked and tended and stubbornly refused to die for 14 months finally. Finally. The world remade itself. That was the only way she would ever be able to describe it. Not a first kiss, but a recognition, the way you recognize a piece of music you've somehow always known. His hands and her hands and the rain on the windows and the lamp holding steady and all of it, had the quality of something returning rather than something beginning. She pulled back slightly to look at his face. He looked wrecked and certain and present in exactly the way she had always wanted someone to look at her and had stopped believing it was something she'd actually get. Hi, he said softly. Hi, she said. He pulled her back in. The first time they made love it was like a conversation that had been interrupted for a year and a half and was now finally, fully being finished. There was no performance in it, no careful presentation of selves, there was only the profound and slightly overwhelming experience of being known, of being looked at completely and not flinched from, and the astonishing heat of a desire that had been compressed and clarified by months of denial into something so pure it almost frightened her. He was generous. Unhurried. He paid attention the way he paid attention to everything entirely, with no part of himself withheld, and she felt, in the genuine physical and emotional marrow of the word, chosen. Specifically. Completely. By someone who had looked directly at her and decided. She held his face in her hands afterward and said nothing, because she was still somewhere inside the experience, still rearranging around it, and he seemed to understand that. Lay quietly with his hand in her hair and let her come back to herself at her own speed, which she would count, later, among the most intimate things he ever gave her. Part 8. What grows in ground that's true. They were not immediately easy. Nothing worth having is immediately easy. There were complicated nights, her grief for the friendship with LENA that she'd loved genuinely, whatever it had become, his grief for the years he'd given to a marriage that had quietly died from within. Neither of them was naive enough to think that passion, however real and consuming, was a substitute for doing that grief properly rather than hiding inside each other. He said, one night, about 2 months in, "I don't want to be a rebound." And she said, "You're not. You were there before. That's the opposite of rebound." "I know. But I want to make sure you know." She kissed him quiet. He laughed softly and let her. The summer was warm and slow and full. She stayed in the house. She made it more hers than it had ever been, planted the back garden in earnest, chose new art for the walls, built a reading corner in the room that had always been a confused not-quite office, and gradually, incrementally, let it become the home she'd always intended, now without the life-shaped structure built around the wrong person. Dante was there often. He was never there in the performing boyfriend way, with grand gestures and constant demonstration. He was there in the lived way, the way that matters more. He knew where she kept her tea, knew when she needed silence and when she needed talking, knew how to say the difficult true thing without cruelty. They discovered, over the course of the summer, that they were extraordinarily well matched. Not in the effortless fantasy way, but in the foundational way, in values, in humor, in the things they found important and the things they easily let go. They argued occasionally, about real things, and discovered they were both capable of being stubborn and capable of being fair, which is the only combination that actually works in the long term. The heat between them did not diminish. This surprised her. She'd half expected desire to fade to something manageable once it was permitted, the way forbidden things sometimes lose their power when the fence comes down. It didn't fade. If anything, it deepened, grew more specific and knowing with time. He knew her. And knowing her, still, looked at her across a room with that expression that made her walk toward him without deciding to. She would be at her drawing desk, working, and he would come stand behind her, and the warmth of him behind her was a physical event, a shift in the atmosphere. And she would feel his mouth at the side of her neck and her hand would stop moving on the paper, and she would lean back into him, and the drawing could wait. Always. The drawing could always wait. Late October. She'd been tired for 2 weeks. Not dramatically tired, just persistently, specifically exhausted in a way she attributed first to a difficult project, then to poor sleep, then to the season, the gray October light that always took a few weeks to adjust to. She went to the doctor as a formality. She drove home after. She sat in the driveway of her house for a long time. Then she went inside, where Dante was working at the kitchen table, papers spread and laptop open, reading something with his glasses on. He'd recently admitted to needing reading glasses, and had bought the most sensible pair imaginable, and she found this so specifically endearing she'd told Jade about it, who had laughed for 3 minutes straight. She stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked up. He saw her face. He took off his glasses. "What happened?" he said. He was already standing. "I need to sit down," she said. "Okay." He was beside her. He took her hand. "Okay, come sit." They sat on the couch. She looked at his hand holding hers and thought, This is the person I want to say this to. This is the only person in the world I want holding my hand for this. "I'm pregnant," she said. He went very still. She looked up at his face, braced for the complexity she expected, shock, concern, the recalculation, and found something that dissolved the armor she'd not realized she was wearing. He looked at her with an expression of such complete and transparent joy that she started crying before she understood she was going to. "Dree," he said. And then he pulled her in and held her, and she felt him exhale long and full and real. "Dree. I know it's," she started. "Don't," he said. "Don't qualify it. Not with me." She held on. "I want this," he said, quiet and certain. "I want this completely. With you. He pulled back to look at her face, to cup it in his hands, tilting it up. "I've wanted a future with you since I stopped being able to pretend I didn't. This is our future." "Okay, this is it." She kissed him. He kissed her back. The October light came through the windows she'd chosen, through the life she'd built and rebuilt, and she was exactly, precisely, correctly here. Epilogue 3. The sonographer said, and here's the third heartbeat. Silence. ANDREANA stared at the screen. Dante, beside her, gripping her hand, said absolutely nothing for a count of 4 seconds. Then he made a sound. A short, specific sound that the sonographer would later describe to a colleague as the most beautiful blindsided laugh I have ever personally witnessed. Andriana turned to look at him. His face was open and astonished and luminous, and she started laughing too, the helpless, surprised, what is happening kind of laughter that fills its space entirely. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. That's 3. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. He pressed his forehead to her temple, and she felt him breathe and felt her own breathing match his, because that was what they did, without deciding, had always done, found each other's rhythm. Okay, he said. Okay, we can do this. We can absolutely do this. 3. Dante. Yeah, I know. He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then her mouth, briefly and tenderly, and with the specific warmth of a man who had chosen this, was still choosing it, would choose it every day going forward without ambivalence or revision. The heartbeats on the screen, 3 of them, a small rapid chorus, said their say. They named them Elena, James, and, after brief, affectionate argument, Ray, which was neither of their first choices, but both of their second, which seemed, in its way, like a blueprint. They were born in a May that everyone agreed was unreasonably beautiful, the weather having apparently decided to cooperate with the narrative. The house, which had been a wound and then a shell and then a home, became something more. It acquired the particular sound of itself that only arrives with small humans in it, not quiet anymore, never quiet again, but full, so full, the kind of full that leaves you exhausted and grateful and strangely, genuinely complete. Dante, who had been afraid of many things in the careful interior of himself, was afraid of none of this. She caught him sometimes, in the early months, standing in the doorway of the nursery at 2 in the morning, not because a baby was crying but just watching, with the expression of a man checking on something he couldn't quite believe was his. She understood it because she felt it too. The disbelief that this much good grew directly out of that much wreckage. That the ground zero of an ordinary Thursday in her driveway, groceries, salmon, a door that needed fixing, a smell that should have told her everything, had been the unlikely, irreplaceable origin point of all of this. Proximity, she thought sometimes, with a smile. Not proximity, she corrected herself. It had never been proximity. Proximity doesn't create things. It just lets things that were already there know they're allowed. They got married in October. The good October, the one with the full trees and the clean light. She wore something she'd found at a shop on Selden, not far from his old building on Selden, which felt like the geometry demanding to complete itself. He cried. Precise, dignified tears, the Dante version of crying, characteristically contained and characteristically real. She held his face in her hands, the way she had that first rainstorm night, and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the whole long, crooked, sometimes terrible road that had brought them to this spot seemed, from this vantage point, to have been somehow exactly the way they were supposed to travel it. Not because the pain had been necessary. She would never tell anyone their pain was necessary. But because the people they'd become on the road through it, honest, specific, undeceived, were the exact people who could love each other correctly. Hi, she said. He smiled. That slow, real, unhurried smile. Hi. The October light came down. The world held its breath and changed. The end.